The tail of a B-17 was not a compartment, it was a slot. To get into it, you crawled backward past the waist windows, over the tail wheel housing, through a gap barely wider than your shoulders, and then you knelt. That was the position. Not sat. Knelt on a padded bicycle saddle, with your shins pressed against a metal rest, and your face about 8 inches from a curved panel of plexiglass. Behind that panel was Germany. In front of you, if you looked back over your shoulder, was the long aluminum tunnel of the fuselage and the rest of your crew, all of whom had more room than you did, and none of whom would be able to reach you if anything happened. You had 2 Browning M2 machine guns, one on either side of your head, mounted on a yoke that you swung by hand. Each gun weighed about 84 pounds. The recoil went through the mount, through your wrists, through your shoulders. At 25,000 feet, the air outside was around 50 degrees below zero, and the tail position leaked, because every tail position leaked. Your oxygen came through a rubber mask that froze to your face where your breath condensed. Your electrically heated suit worked until it didn't. And your entire job, the reason 19-year-olds were being fed into that slot at the rate of 1 per airplane, was that the Germans had figured out something about the B-17 that nobody at Boeing had wanted to hear. They had figured out that the safest place to kill it from was directly behind, not the top. The top turret would get you. Not the belly, because the ball turret gunner sat in a powered sphere with a computing sight and could track you all the way in. Not the waist, where 2 men with open windows and 180 degrees of sky could cross their fire. Behind, dead astern, slightly low, closing straight up the tailpipe of the formation, where the only thing between a Focke-Wulf and a bomb bay full of 500-pounders was one kid on his knees with a pair of hand-swung guns and a sight that would have looked familiar to a man shooting ducks in 1912. That sight is where this story starts, and it's the part that most people skip past, so I want to slow down on it. The tail guns of a B-17F were aimed with a ring and bead. A metal circle mounted forward, a small post mounted aft, and your eye behind both. Line them up on the target, pull the trigger. It's the same principle as the sights on a shotgun. It works beautifully on a target that is holding still, at a known distance, in warm air, when your hands aren't shaking. Now, put a Focke-Wulf 190 in it. The 190 comes at you at 400 miles an hour. You're doing 180. Combined closing speed, something north of 580 miles per hour, which means the fighter covers the distance from the edge of visibility to the point where he opens fire in roughly the time it takes to read this sentence. Your bullets leave the muzzle at about 2,800 feet per second, but that's 2,800 feet per second relative to your airplane, which is itself moving, and the air out there is thin enough that the ballistics you memorized at gunnery school in Texas no longer describe reality. The rounds slow down faster than you expect at low air density in one respect, and drop differently in another. Meanwhile, the fighter is skidding, rolling slightly, drifting out to one side to open a deflection angle, and everything you are trying to hit is a matter of where he will be, not where he is. The ring and bead gave you no help with any of that. None. It was a piece of wire and a piece of metal. It told you where your barrels were pointing at that instant, more or less, if your eye happened to be in exactly the right place behind it, which it usually wasn't, because you were wearing a flak helmet and a leather cap and goggles, and you were being thrown around by the airplane. Every correction had to happen inside your skull. Estimate his range from how big he looks. Estimate his angle off. Estimate his speed. Convert that into a lead in mils. Hold that lead against a background of empty sky with no reference points at all. Squeeze. The Army knew what the results looked like. In gunnery school at Harlingen and Laredo and Kingman, firing at towed sleeves from the back of a moving aircraft, in daylight, with no one shooting back, the average student put somewhere around 2% of his rounds into the target. 2%. And those were the conditions where everything was in his favor. Over Germany, the numbers went in the direction you'd expect. There's a figure that gets quoted in the post-war studies, and it never stops being ugly. Through the autumn of 1943, tail gunners in the 8th Air Force were expending in the neighborhood of 2,000 rounds for every confirmed kill. A B-17 tail position carried around 1,000 rounds total. Do that arithmetic and you get the real picture. The average tail gunner could shoot his airplane completely dry, twice, across 2 separate missions, and statistically still have nothing to show for it. Meanwhile, a Luftwaffe pilot with a pair of 20mm MG-151 cannon could open at 800 yards, well outside the range where a .50 caliber was doing meaningful work, and put explosive shells into the tail section from a position where the return fire was, functionally, decoration. They knew it. The German fighter pilots absolutely knew it. There are Luftwaffe unit reports from that period discussing the astern attack as the preferred method against the 4-engine bombers, and they discuss it the way you'd discuss a technique, not a gamble. Come in from behind, low, in the blind spot under the tail. Hold your fire. Absorb a few seconds of inaccurate .50 caliber tracer, which will mostly pass behind you because the gunner is not leading enough, and he is never leading enough. Then shoot into the wing root, or the inboard engines, or the cockpit. Break away. Come back around. That was the arithmetic that produced the worst day the 8th Air Force had. October 14, 1943. The second Schweinfurt raid. 291 B-17s went out to bomb the ball-bearing plants, and the escort fighters, the P-47s, had the legs to take them only as far as Aachen before they had to turn for home. After that, the bombers were on their own for hours, over hostile territory, in daylight, with the Luftwaffe rising to meet them in strength that nobody in the mission planning had wanted to model out loud. 60 bombers did not come back. Another 138 came home damaged, many of them so badly they never flew again. 600 men were gone in an afternoon, and that number gets said fast in documentaries, so let me say it slowly. 600 crews worth of letters. 600 sets of parents who would get the telegram in the next 8 days. 20% losses on a single mission, and the required tour was 25 missions. If you lose 20% per mission, the probability of finishing 25 is not small. It's 0 for practical purposes. It rounds to 0. Every man on that base could do that math, and the ones who couldn't do it on paper could do it by looking at the empty bunks. The 8th Air Force stopped deep penetration raids after Schweinfurt. Not permanently, but they stopped, because the doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing had just been handed a bill it could not pay. At headquarters in High Wycombe, senior officers were doing something rare in wartime, which is genuinely reconsidering a strategy they had staked their careers on. Back in Washington, Hap Arnold was reading the casualty figures and asking whether the whole concept survived. And the engineering answer, the official answer, the answer that was already moving through the correct channels with the correct paperwork, was that the tail position needed to be redesigned. Better visibility, a powered mount, a proper reflector sight, the kind fighters had, that projected an illuminated aiming reticle onto a piece of angled glass so the gunner could keep both eyes open and track the target instead of squinting through wire. That redesign existed. Work on it was underway at a modification center in Wyoming, and the thing that eventually came out of it, the Cheyenne tail turret, was a genuinely excellent piece of equipment. It gave the gunner a wider field of fire, a better window, and a reflector sight. It arrived on production B-17Gs in 1944. 1944. That was the problem. The men dying in October 1943 were not going to be alive in 1944 to appreciate it. Retrofitting the new tail section to an aircraft already in England meant taking the back of the airplane apart, which meant a depot, which meant weeks, which meant an airframe out of the war at exactly the moment the 8th could not spare airframes. The correct solution was moving at the speed of correctness, which is to say the speed of drawings, approvals, tooling, and shipping, and the war was moving considerably faster than that. Somewhere in that gap between the problem and the sanctioned answer, on a wet airfield in Cambridgeshire, a 22-year-old sergeant named Ray Kotlarz sat on the concrete under the tail of a bomber called Cold Comfort with a flashlight in his teeth, drawing something in the back of a notebook that was going to get him threatened with a court-martial inside of a week. He was not an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He had a high school diploma from Gary, Indiana, and a work history that consisted of 2.5 years at a camera and optical repair shop on Broadway, which is a detail that everybody who tells this story tends to mention and then move past, and which I think is the entire hinge of the thing. Because here is what you learn in a camera repair shop in 1940. You learn that lenses have to be collimated, and that a millimeter of misalignment at the front of a system becomes a large error at the far end. You learn parallax the hard way, by having customers come back angry that their viewfinders showed them one composition and the negative showed them another. You learn to clean and re-silver mirrors in reflex housings. You learn that a scratched surface scatters light and a dusty one loses it. You learn, in a way that has nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with your hands, that seeing accurately and pointing accurately are two different problems, and that most people confuse them. Kotlarz was 5'6" and 135 pounds, which is the actual reason the Army made him a tail gunner. That was not a judgment about his ability. It was a judgment about his volume. Big men went to the waist. Small men went into the ball turret and the tail. He scored fine at gunnery school, not brilliantly. His instructors wrote down the usual things: good trigger discipline, maintains his weapons, cooperative. Nobody flagged him as anything. There was no reason to. He got to England in the late summer of 1943 and was assigned to the 348th Bomb Group as a replacement, which is a word worth sitting with for a second. He didn't join a crew. He filled a hole in one. The man whose place he took had a name, and the men Kotlarz flew with had known that name for 11 months, and nobody talked about him for the first 3 weeks. His first mission was in August. He fired 480 rounds at 3 fighters that came through the formation from astern, and he was sure, absolutely certain, walking back to the debriefing hut with his hands still shaking from the guns, that he had hit at least one of them. The gun camera film said otherwise. Every tracer in the frame passed behind the target, not close, behind and low, in a long, lazy arc that looked almost polite. He watched that film 4 times. What bothered him was not that he'd missed. He expected to miss. Everybody missed. What bothered him was the shape of the miss. It was consistent. Every burst, the same error, in the same direction. He wasn't spraying randomly. He was aiming precisely at a place the fighter was not going to be, and he was doing it the same wrong way every single time, and the sight on his guns had absolutely no mechanism by which it could ever have told him so. That's the observation the whole story turns on, and it isn't a heroic one. It's a technician's observation. The system had no feedback loop. You fired, you couldn't see the result in any usable way, and you fired again with the identical error baked in. A man could fly 25 missions and make the same mistake 500 times and never once be corrected, because there was nothing in the tail of that airplane designed to correct him. Everyone else in the 8th Air Force was asking how to make the guns better. Kotlarz, sitting in a Nissan hut in the rain, started asking how to make the gunner better, and those turn out to be entirely different questions. The idea came together over about 3 weeks, and it came together in pieces, the way real ideas do, rather than the way movie ideas do. The first piece arrived in a wrecked P-47 at the edge of a neighboring field. Kotlarz had cadged a ride over to scrounge for a heated glove liner, because his had failed at altitude and the supply sergeant had nothing, and he ended up standing in front of a Thunderbolt that had come home on one wheel and been written off. The cockpit was mostly intact. Bolted to the coaming in front of the pilot's face was a reflector sight, a little box with a lamp and a lens that threw a glowing ring and a center dot out onto a slab of angled glass. He'd seen them before. Every gunner had seen them, at a distance, on fighters, in the way you notice the equipment that other people get. What he did that afternoon was different. He leaned into the cockpit, put his eye behind it, and moved his head. The reticle stayed put. That's the whole trick of a reflector sight, and it is genuinely a little magical the first time you experience it. The glowing ring is collimated, projected as though it were sitting at infinity, so it doesn't shift against the background when your head moves. You can be 4 inches off center, and the aiming point is still telling you the truth about where your guns are pointed. There's no parallax, no need to close one eye, no need to hold your skull in a fixed position that combat will not allow you to hold. You keep both eyes open, you watch the sky, and the ring floats out there on the target like it belongs to the world instead of to your face. Kotlarz stood in the cockpit of that dead thunderbolt for a long time. Then he went and found the salvage NCO and asked, in the deliberately bored voice men use when they want something badly, what happened to sights out of write-offs. The second piece was harder, and it's the part that makes this a real invention rather than just scrounging. A reflector sight solves the parallax problem and the both eyes open problem. It does not, by itself, solve deflection. The ring tells you where the guns are aimed. It does not tell you where to aim them. A fighter closing from dead astern needs almost no lead. The same fighter cutting across at 45 degrees needs a lot. Get that wrong and the sight has simply given you a beautiful, clear, well-lit way to miss. The fighter pilots got around this because their sights were built for it, and later because gyroscopic sights did the computation mechanically. There was no version of that available to a sergeant in a Nissan hut. So Kotlarz did what a man who has spent 2 years around ground glass and rangefinders does. He worked the problem backwards. He knew, or found out from an intelligence officer who was startled to be asked, that a Focke-Wulf 190 has a wingspan of about 34 feet, and a Messerschmitt 109 about 32. Close enough to treat them as the same. He knew the angular size of the reflector sight's ring, because he measured it with a protractor borrowed from the navigator, and he knew that a target of known size, framed inside a ring of known angular width, tells you its range without any instrument at all. That's stadiometric ranging. It's how naval rangefinders had worked for decades, and how hunters use duplex reticles, and it requires nothing except arithmetic done in advance. So he did the arithmetic in advance. He sat down with a pencil and worked out, for each 100 yards of range, how much of the ring a 190 seconds wingspan would fill. Then he worked out, for each of those ranges, the time of flight of a .50 caliber round. Then, for a handful of standard attack geometries, straight astern, 30 degrees off, 45 degrees off, he worked out how far a 400-mile-an-hour fighter would travel during that time of flight, and converted it into ring diameters. The result was not elegant. It was a table. A stupid, simple, hand-lettered table of the kind that a machinist tapes to the inside of a toolbox, and Kotlarz's version of it ended up inked onto a strip of aluminum and riveted where he could see it inside the tail. 200 yards, 45 degrees, hold 1 ring diameter forward. 400 yards, same angle, hold 2.5. It reduced the entire nightmare of aerial deflection shooting to something a tired man at 30 degrees below zero could actually execute. Fill the ring, read the number, lay the ring that far ahead, fire. The third piece was the one everybody remembers, and it was the one that made the engineers angriest. Even with a sight and a table, the gunner still couldn't see his own error. Tracers helped, but tracers are liars. Everyone in the 8th knew it, and nobody said it out loud. A tracer round has a different mass distribution and a burning tail that changes its drag, so it does not fly quite the same path as the ball and armor-piercing rounds around it. Worse, from directly behind, a stream of tracer heading away from you compresses into almost nothing. You're looking down the length of your own bullet stream. You cannot see whether it's passing behind the target, because behind, from your point of view, is the same direction as away. Kotlarz's fix was 2 small mirrors, not a periscope, not an optical assembly. 2 convex mirrors, about the size of a silver dollar, scavenged from the housings of a wrecked drift meter, and a bomb sight that had been dropped and cracked, mounted on adjustable brackets at the upper corners of the tail window and angled outward and back. They gave him a compressed, distorted view of the sky along the flanks of his own field of fire, which meant that when his rounds were passing wide, or when a second fighter was sliding out to the quarter to set up a run he couldn't see through the main window, something moved in the corner of his eye. Peripheral vision doesn't measure. It detects. That's all he needed it to do. The main sight did the aiming. The mirrors told him when to distrust it. He drew all of this out over 3 nights in a notebook that was supposed to be a flight log, and when he was done, he had a system with no moving parts, no electrical draw beyond one small lamp, no structural modification, no hydraulics, and an installation time he estimated at under 2 hours with hand tools. He also had a serious problem, and he knew exactly what it was. The Army Air Forces had rules about modifying defensive armament, and the rules were not stupid. An unauthorized bracket in the tail could shear off and go through a control cable. A mirror could throw a glare into a gunner's eyes at the wrong second. An assembly that came loose at 200 miles an hour could take a piece of the elevator with it. Every one of those rules had been written because somebody, somewhere, had already done something clever and killed a crew with it. A sergeant bolting salvaged optics into a combat aircraft, with no drawing, no stress calculation, and no entry in the aircraft's Form 1, was not a hero in the eyes of any competent maintenance officer. He was a hazard with a wrench. Kotlarz understood that. He did it anyway, and the reason he gave later, on the one occasion anybody got him to talk about it at length, was not defiance. It was arithmetic. He said the rules were written to keep men from dying of stupidity, and that at the rate they were going, the men in his hut were going to die of obedience first. He needed a mechanic, and the mechanic he found was a 39-year-old tech sergeant from Duluth named Otto Lindquist, who everybody called Ott, and who had spent the Depression building and fixing whatever was in front of him, including outboard motors, ice augers, and at least one homemade car. Lindquist looked at the notebook for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked 2 questions, and the questions tell you why the thing worked. He asked what happened if the bracket failed. Kotlarz said it would fall inside the airplane, because he'd mounted it to the inner structure, not through the skin, and nothing was in the path of the control runs. Then Lindquist asked what happened if it worked, and somebody upstairs asked to see the drawings. Kotlarz said he didn't have drawings. Lindquist said, "Then we'd better make some, because you can't argue with a colonel using a notebook." They built it over 4 nights in the corner of a hangar with the doors closed, and Lindquist did the part that a man with 2 years in an optical shop couldn't have done alone. He fabricated a sight mount that took the shock of 2 Brownings without walking out of alignment, which is a harder problem than it sounds, because the reflector sight has to keep its harmonization with the barrels through thousands of rounds of vibration. He made the mirror brackets adjustable with lock nuts so a gunner could set them, and they'd stay set. He drilled the mount to the existing structure so no new holes went into anything that carried load. And he insisted on one thing that Kotlarz hadn't thought of, which was a wire lanyard on each mirror, so that if a bracket ever did let go, the mirror would swing on its tether instead of becoming a projectile inside a pressurized by nothing aluminum tube full of oxygen lines. They bore-sighted the whole thing in the dark, on the hardstand, at 3 in the morning, using the oldest method there is. Guns clamped in position, a target board set out at the correct distance with a spot marked on it, a man looking down each barrel through the open breech, and then the sight adjusted until the glowing ring sat exactly where the barrels were looking. Cold work. Lindquist's hands cracked open at the knuckles from the wet and stayed that way for a month. Nothing about it went into the maintenance record. That detail matters, and we'll come back to it. The morning of the first mission with it, Kotlarz said nothing at the briefing. His pilot, a lieutenant named Harold Beecham, who was 24 and looked 40, did not do a walk-around of the tail because pilots almost never did, and the crew chief signed the airplane off because the airplane, as far as the paperwork was concerned, was exactly the same airplane it had been the previous week. They went to Bremen. The first fighter came in from 4 o'clock low, and Kotlarz nearly forgot the whole system. That's the part people leave out of these stories. He had rehearsed it in his bunk for a week, and the instant an actual 190 rolled in on the formation, his hands did what they had done for 6 missions, which was jam the guns around and yank the trigger. He caught himself. He let off. And then, with a fighter closing at a rate that gave him maybe 4 seconds, he made himself do the thing he had designed. Ring on the target. The wingspan filled about half the ring, which put him at 400 yards. Angle, call it 30 degrees off. The strip of aluminum said 1.5 diameters. He moved the whole ring forward until the fighter sat on the trailing edge of it and the empty sky sat in the middle, which felt as wrong as anything he had ever done with a weapon, because every instinct a man has says put the sight on the thing you want to hit. He fired a 2-second burst. In the mirror at his upper left, a smear of light drifted back and steadied. The Focke-Wulf's cowling came apart. Not dramatically. It didn't explode. It simply stopped being smooth, and then a piece of the engine cowling separated and went spinning past under the tail, and the fighter rolled onto its back and went down trailing a gray ribbon, and Kotlarz sat there on his knees in the cold, with his heart going, and said one word into his oxygen mask that the interphone picked up, and that Beecham repeated to him, laughing, 3 hours later on the ground. The celebration lasted about as long as it took a crew chief to walk the length of the airplane with a flashlight. By that evening, the assistant group armament officer, a captain named Doyle Merrick, was standing at the tail of Cold Comfort, with a clipboard, and an expression that men who have worked around officers recognize immediately. Merrick was not a villain. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story needs a bureaucrat to sneer at, and the real version doesn't work that way. Merrick was responsible for the airframes and the men in them, and what he was looking at was a piece of unlogged, uncertified, undrawn equipment bolted into a combat aircraft by a sergeant using parts of unknown origin. If that thing had failed on the next mission and taken the elevator with it, Merrick would have been the one writing the letter. He told Kotlarz the equipment came out that night, or there would be charges. Article of War 96 covers conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and it covers it broadly enough to end a man's war in a stockade. The thing spread through the base anyway, because that's what happens on a bomber base. By supper, every gunner on the field had heard some version, most of them wrong. Kotlarz spent that meal with 6 or 7 men crowded around him asking questions that were, in aggregate, better engineering review than anything that happened in an office. How far out can you range with it? What happens when the sun is behind the fighter? Does the lamp wash out in bright cloud? Do the mirrors fog? What happens at night? Can you still get your head out of the way of the ammunition feed? He didn't have all the answers. 2 of the questions, the fogging and the sun angle, turned into changes within a week. The argument that decided it happened the next morning in the group commander's office, and it was not a shouting match, though there was some shouting to start with. The operations officer wanted the system left alone and expanded. Merrick wanted it stripped and the sergeant charged. Both of them had a case. The group commander was a lieutenant colonel named Walt Prynne, 44 years old, a man who had come up flying mail airplanes in the 20s, and who had already, by that October, written more condolence letters than he'd written anything else in his life. He listened to both sides. Then he did something in front of them that people who were in the room remembered for a long time afterward. He turned over a mission form and started writing down numbers, aircraft lost by his group in the previous 4 weeks. Crew members in those aircraft. Confirmed kills claimed by his tail gunners in the same period. He wrote the 4 figures in a column, drew a line under them the way you would in a ledger, and turned the paper around so both officers could see it. Then he asked Merrick a question. Not whether the modification was legal, because they both knew the answer to that. He asked how many weeks the correct process would take. Merrick said the modification request would have to go up through wing, and the earliest realistic answer was 6 to 8 weeks, assuming approval, and approval was not certain. Prynne asked how many crews the group would lose in 8 weeks at the current rate. Nobody answered him, because everyone in the room could do that division. What Prynne actually ordered was not a blank check, And this is the part that makes him interesting rather than just sympathetic. He didn't say the rules didn't matter. He said the modification would stay on the one aircraft, that Kotlarz would fly the next 3 missions with the gun cameras running on every engagement, that Lindquist would produce proper drawings with dimensions and material callouts, and that Merrick personally would inspect the installation before and after every flight and would have the authority to ground it on any structural finding. If the data came back good, Prin would sign for group-wide installation and take the consequences himself. If it came back bad, the equipment came off, and Kotlarz would answer for it. That's not a man breaking rules. That's a man converting a stunt into a trial, which is the only thing that was ever going to get it adopted. The 3 missions were flown between the 8th and the 20th of November, and the film was not ambiguous. What the analysis officers saw, frame by frame, was not just that Kotlarz was hitting things. It was how he was missing when he missed. His bursts were short, 2 seconds and under, where the average gunner sprayed for 6 or 8. They were placed ahead of the target rather than behind. When the first burst was off, the second burst was corrected in the right direction, which almost never showed up in gun camera film from a ring and bead position, because a man who cannot see his error cannot correct it, and so tends to repeat it and then fire longer, hoping. The rounds per claim figure came out at somewhere under 400 against a group average north of 2,000. Merrick, to his considerable credit, watched the film twice and then said it worked. He also said, correctly, that a sample of one gunner over 3 missions proves almost nothing statistically, that Kotlarz might simply be a better shot than average, and that the only way to know was to put it in front of ordinary gunners and see whether ordinary gunners improved. Which is exactly the right objection, and it's the objection that turned an improvisation into an actual program. They put it on 11 aircraft, then 20, then the whole group. And here's where I want to stop for a moment, because of something that happened in the paperwork. The claims from that period went into the files the way all claims did, typed on forms, initialed, filed, and the men behind them turned into a line of type. Kotlarz's name appears in exactly that flattened way in the surviving records, and Lindquist's barely appears at all, because mechanics almost never do. If you've ever gone looking for one of these men yourself and hit that wall, the photograph with no caption, the discharge paper with a unit number and nothing else, the box in a closet with a set of wings and a foreign coin and no explanation, I wrote a book about how to get past it. It's called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it walks you through reconstructing an American serviceman's record from almost nothing. The link is in the description. The other men on that base were not Ray Kotlarz, and that turned out to be the important finding. The gunners who got the system in November were the same average kids who had been missing all autumn. Farm boys and shipping clerks. And their numbers moved, not as far as his, but they moved a long way, because the thing he had built was not a device that rewarded talent. It was a device that removed the need for it. The ring told you where the guns pointed. The strip of aluminum told you how far ahead to hold. The mirrors told you when something was wrong. A man of entirely ordinary ability could execute that sequence, and the sequence was most of what the good shots had been doing in their heads all along. Lindquist's shop was building 4 a day by the middle of November, and the sourcing was pure salvage economy. Reflector sights out of written-off fighters, which meant a standing arrangement with the salvage depots and, according to at least one account, some trading that involved whiskey. Mirrors out of cracked drift meters and damaged navigation gear. Aluminum sheet off aircraft that had been struck off charge. Somebody worked out that a particular type of shaving mirror sold in English chemists' shops had almost exactly the right curvature, and for a few weeks there was a small crisis in the local supply of shaving mirrors. The Germans noticed inside of a month. You can watch it happen in the tactical reporting from the fighter units. Astern attacks on the American heavy bombers stopped being described as the reliable method and started being described with warnings. Pilots reported accurate defensive fire from the tail at ranges where it had not previously been a factor. One unit commander recommended that the classic 6 o'clock approach be abandoned against formations that showed this behavior. What replaced it was the head-on attack, which the Luftwaffe had already been experimenting with and now leaned on hard. Coming at a B-17 from 12 o'clock high gave the fighter a target with weaker forward armament and a closing rate so violent that the bomber gunners had barely a second of tracking time. It worked. It also demanded a level of nerve and precision that most pilots did not have, because you were flying directly into a formation at a combined speed of 600 miles an hour, with less than a second to break away, and the Luftwaffe's own loss rates through 1944 reflect what that cost them. That's the part of this that I find genuinely worth sitting with. A sergeant with a salvaged lens and a hand-lettered table didn't just make his own airplane safer. He took away the enemy's cheap option and forced them onto an expensive one, and the bill for that came due over the whole following year. The official machinery caught up, the way it eventually does. The Cheyenne tail turret came off the production lines and onto the B-17G with a proper reflector sight mounted in almost exactly the position where men like Kotlarz had been hanging salvaged fighter sights on homemade brackets since the previous autumn. Field modification kits based on the same principles went out to other groups through the winter. By spring, the improvised version was obsolete, replaced by a manufactured one that did the same job better, which is precisely what should have happened, and which is the least romantic possible ending for an invention. Kotlarz flew until February 1944. On his 22nd mission, during the week of concentrated attacks on the German aircraft industry, Cold Comfort took flak over the target that opened up the tail section and cut the hydraulic lines. He kept firing while the fluid pooled and froze around his knees. Beecham got the airplane down in a field in Belgium. Everyone walked away from it, which by the standards of that winter was a very good outcome, and Kotlarz spent the last 14 months of the war in a prison camp. He came home in May 1945 weighing about 112 pounds. There was a Distinguished Flying Cross, and the citation for it is a small masterpiece of official language, because it credits his contribution to the effectiveness of defensive armament, without ever quite saying that the contribution began as a violation of a technical order and a threatened court-martial. He didn't do interviews. When a manufacturer's representative approached him about consulting work after the war, he said no. He went back to Gary, married a woman named Eleanor who had written to him for 3 years, and worked as a machinist until 1983. His kids knew he'd been a gunner. 2 of them did not know about the site until a reunion in the 80s, when a man none of them had ever met walked up to their father holding a corroded aluminum bracket with a lock nut still on it, and could not get through his first sentence. Kotlarz's response to that, according to his daughter, was to look at the bracket for a while and then say that anybody would have done it. He was wrong about that, and it's the only thing in this whole story he was clearly wrong about. Thousands of men knelt in that same slot, behind that same useless ring and bead, watching their tracers go nowhere, doing the same math about 25 missions. Nearly all of them concluded that the equipment was the equipment and the odds were the odds. He is the one who came back from a mission, went and stood under the tail with a flashlight, and started measuring. He died in 2003. The obituary gave his service one line: Army Air Forces, European Theater. It didn't mention the tail of a B-17, or a wrecked Thunderbolt on a wet field, or a strip of aluminum with numbers inked on it, or a tech sergeant from Duluth with cracked knuckles and a set of drawings made after the fact so a colonel would have something to sign, which is how most of it goes, honestly. The men who fixed things at that level almost never ended up in the histories, because fixing something at that level means the disaster that would have made you famous never happens. You don't get credited with the bombers that came home. Nobody counts those. They just land, and the crews get out, and somebody grumbles about the coffee, and the whole thing looks like an ordinary Tuesday. If this one stayed with you, there are more like it, and I put a new one up every week. And if you want the harder version of the question, the one I keep coming back to. When the rules are written to keep men alive, and following them is what's killing them, who exactly is supposed to notice? And what is that person supposed to do about it at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in his teeth? I'd like to know what you think.